The morning Catherine Collins buried her husband, the sky above Clearwater. Texas did not have the decency to rain. It stayed blue and bright and entirely indifferent, and the sun beat down on the 32 mourners gathered at the edge of the churchyard with the kind of cheerful cruelty that only nature can manage when a person's world is falling apart. Catherine stood at the head of the fresh grave, her black dress already damp at the collar from the August heat of 1878, her hands folded in front of her like she had been told to hold them that way, and could not remember being told anything else. She watched them lower Robert Collins into the red Texas earth, and she felt nothing except the precise weight of everyone watching her to see if she would cry. She did not cry. She had done her crying 3 weeks earlier, when Dr. Hennessy had sat across from her kitchen table and told her that Robert's lungs were not going to recover, that the pneumonia had gone too deep, that she should prepare herself. She had cried then, alone in the kitchen after the doctor left, sitting on the floor with her back against the cold iron stove. She had cried until her throat hurt and her eyes were dry and burning. By the time Robert actually died, on a Tuesday morning in late July with the curtains moving in a small breeze, she had felt something closer to exhausted relief than grief, and then she had felt guilty for feeling that, and the guilt had swallowed everything else whole. Now she stood at the grave while Reverend Moore read from his Bible, and she was aware of the other women watching her with their heads tilted at a particular angle that she had come to recognize as practiced sympathy. She was aware of the men looking at her land out of the corner of their eyes, calculating things she would not have been able to name a year ago, but understood perfectly now. She was 29 years old, widowed, and the sole owner of 40 acres of decent farmland 3 miles outside of Clearwater. She was also, though she did not yet know the full weight of it, completely alone. Robert had been gone in the way that mattered for much longer than 3 weeks. The sickness had taken him slowly, piece by piece, over 18 months. First his strength, then his ambition, then his patience, and finally the quality that Catherine had loved best in him when she was 23 and he was 26, and they stood in this same churchyard and made their promises. He had been funny, Robert. He had made her laugh in the early years. By the end he made her tired, and then he made her afraid, and then he made her nothing at all, and she had sat beside his bed every evening reading to him, from whatever book the lending library had available, and tried to remember the man she had married. She walked home from the burial alone. The neighbors offered to accompany her, and she declined with the kind of quiet firmness that people in Clearwater had already begun to associate with Catherine Collins. She walked the 2 miles back to the farmhouse through the heat, her good shoes raising small clouds of dust with every step, and when she pushed open the front door and stood in the hallway that smelled of beeswax and old wool, she understood for the first time the specific silence of a house that had become entirely hers. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The farm had suffered during the 18 months of Robert's illness, and Catherine had no illusions about that. The south field had not been properly cultivated last season. The fence along the eastern boundary needed at least 3 new posts. The small barn was sound enough, but the tack room had a leak she had been covering with a tin pail since April. The money Robert had saved was modest, and she had worked through the figures enough times to know that she had perhaps 1 good growing season to turn things around before the savings ran dry, and she would have to make a different kind of decision about her future. She had not been raised to be weak about practical matters. Her father, Marcus Peterson, had been a farmer in Missouri before he died when Catherine was 15, and he had raised her with the kind of pragmatic affection that included teaching her to read a ledger, to judge the health of a field by the color of the soil, and to negotiate at the grain merchants without blinking first. Her mother had remarried and moved to Kansas City, and Catherine visited once a year and found the visits pleasant and slightly foreign, as though they had both become different women than either of them had expected and were being very polite about it. Catherine spent the first week after the burial doing nothing but inventory. She walked every acre of the property with a small notebook and a pencil and wrote down everything that needed doing. The list was long enough to be discouraging, but she refused to be discouraged by a list. She had hired one hand during Robert's illness, a quiet boy named Thomas who was 17 and good with horses but not much else, and she kept him on because she could not manage everything herself, and because she had a soft spot for quiet boys who worked hard and asked for nothing. It was Thomas who told her about Luke Dawson. He mentioned it one evening when he was putting the mare away, and Catherine was oiling the hinges on the barn door. He said it in the careful, sideways manner of someone delivering information they are not entirely sure will be welcome. He said that there was a man who had taken up a small property about 1.5 miles northwest of her farm, just the other side of the creek that people called Miller's Creek, though nobody named Miller had ever lived near it. He said the man had been there about 2 months, that he kept mostly to himself, and that he had a good reputation from what Thomas had heard at the feed store. Catherine said, "Is that so?" and went back to oiling the hinges. Thomas said, "He used to drive cattle before. He knows about land." Catherine said, "Most people in Clearwater know about land, Thomas." Thomas said nothing further, which was one of the things she appreciated about him. She did not think about Luke Dawson. She had enough to think about. The summer moved through its final weeks with its particular brand of Texas ferocity, and Catherine worked from before sunrise until the light failed. She planted a late-season kitchen garden that she had neglected earlier in the year. She repaired the fence with Thomas's help and the assistance of her nearest neighbor, a widow named Edna Marsh who was 62 and had been farming alone since her husband died in 1869, and who Catherine found quietly instructive. Edna did not offer opinions unless asked, but when she was asked she was direct and honest in a way that Catherine had come to value enormously. Edna had told her, the week after Robert died, that the first year was going to be the hardest, and that if she could get through it with her land and her mind intact she would be all right. Catherine intended to get through it. The complication arrived in September in the form of the creek. Miller's Creek ran along the northern edge of Catherine's property, and the water rights to it had always been, technically, a shared matter between her farm and the land to the northwest. Robert had an informal understanding with the previous owner of that property, a man named Gerald Holt who had sold up and moved to San Antonio. The arrangement had been simple and unremarkable, something handled with a handshake and never put to paper, because that was how Robert handled things, and because Gerald Holt was the kind of man who considered written agreements an insult to one's word. Luke Dawson had purchased the property from Gerald Holt in June, and he had no knowledge of any informal arrangement about creek access, because no one had told him, and there was nothing written down to tell him. Catherine discovered this when she went to check on the small diversion channel that fed water to her north field and found that it had been altered, not maliciously, just redirected in the way that made sense if you owned the adjacent property and did not know about a neighboring farm's reliance on a particular flow pattern. She stood at the altered channel for a long moment with her hands on her hips, and the sun bright on the water, and thought about how this was exactly the kind of problem that Robert would have handled poorly, and how she was going to have to handle it herself. She changed into her second-best dress, not her good dress because this was a business matter, and she did not want to appear to be making any other kind of effort, and she walked northwest along the creek bank through a stand of cottonwood trees that dappled the path with moving light and shadow. She was rehearsing what she intended to say, keeping it plain and civil and direct, when she came around the bend in the creek and saw the property for the first time. It was a modest setup. A small stone house, newer than it looked, with a porch that ran the length of the front face. A barn in better condition than her own. A corral with 4 horses moving lazily in the afternoon heat. A kitchen garden that she noticed immediately was laid out with considerable care, the rows straight and properly spaced, The plants staked where staking was needed. She noticed these things because she noticed them in everything now, the same way a person who has been hungry notices food in every room. Luke Dawson was splitting wood at the side of the house. She had not given much thought to what he would look like. She had formed some vague impression from Thomas's description of a cattle man, which suggested someone weathered and largely uncomplicated. Luke Dawson was tall. She saw that first. He was broad across the shoulders in the way that came from years of actual physical labor rather than any deliberate effort toward it. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that looked like it had opinions about things. He was probably 35, she thought, maybe a year or two either side. He saw her at approximately the same moment she saw him, and he set the axe down against the woodpile with the particular unhurried ease of someone who was not caught off guard by much. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Dawson," she said, because Thomas had given her his name and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. "My name is Catherine Collins. I own the farm to your southeast." He looked at her with steady brown eyes that were taking in considerably more than just what she said. "I know who you are, Mrs. Collins. I'm sorry for your loss." She had heard that phrase 40 times in the past month, and it had worn to almost nothing from the repetition, but he said it without the tilted head performance she had come to dread, and it landed differently for the plainness of it. "Thank you," she said. "I've come about the creek." She explained the situation with the directness she had prepared. The diversion channel, the previous arrangement with Gerald Holt, the Northfield's dependence on that particular water flow. She did not accuse him of anything because he had not done anything wrong, and she was careful to make that clear while also being equally clear that the situation as it now stood was going to damage her crop. He listened without interrupting. That was the first thing she noticed about him, properly noticed, as something that distinguished him from most of the men she had spoken to in the past year. He listened to the end before he said anything. When she finished, he said, "Gerald Holt didn't mention anything about that arrangement to me." "I know he didn't," she said. "That's because Robert and Gerald did most of their business on a handshake, which I have discovered creates difficulties for everyone involved after the fact." Something moved in his expression, brief and genuine, that might have been amusement. "I can move the channel back to where it was. It won't change much for my setup. I hadn't thought about it being connected to your north field." "I would appreciate that," she said. "I can do it this week," he said. She said, "I'll help. It goes faster with two." He looked at her for a moment, a long considering look that was not rude but was thorough, and then he said, "All right." She had not planned to offer to help. She was not sure why she had. Efficiency, she told herself walking home. It genuinely did go faster with two people. That was the whole of it. They worked on the channel 2 days later, on a Thursday morning when the air was still cool enough to make labor bearable. He had already done the preliminary work by the time she arrived, which she noticed but did not remark on. They worked in a manner that was largely silent but not uncomfortably so, and she found that he moved with an efficiency that she recognized as coming from someone who understood how to work with a piece of land rather than against it. He knew the angle of the slope. He thought about the water's natural inclination before redirecting it rather than after. She said at one point, "You've done this kind of thing before," he said, "on a bigger scale. Trail work involves a lot of moving water," she said. "You drove cattle long," he said, 11 years up from South Texas. Kansas mostly in the later years. She said, "What made you stop?" He was quiet for a moment, rearranging a section of stone edging before he answered. "I got tired of owning nothing at the end of the day," he said. "You move 1,000 cattle 1,000 miles, and at the end of it, they belong to someone else, and the land you crossed belongs to someone else, and the sky you slept under was someone else's sky. I wanted something that was mine." She understood that with the whole of her body, not just the thinking part of her mind. She said so. She said, "Yes," and meant it with more weight than the single syllable could carry. He looked up from what he was doing and met her eyes, and the look lasted a beat longer than practical conversation required. She went back to work. By the time the channel was properly restored, and the water was running correctly through the diversion to her north field. It was past noon, and they were both dirty from the clay-heavy soil at the creek bank. He offered water from the pump at his place, and she accepted, and they stood in the shade of the cottonwoods near the creek and drank cold water from tin cups and looked at the running water for a few minutes without talking. He said, "If you run into other issues with the property, Mrs. Collins, feel free to come by." She said, "Catherine." He said, "Catherine," and it sounded different in his voice than it had in other people's mouths for the past month, and she could not have explained the difference if someone had asked her to. She said, "Luke," because it seemed appropriate to balance the thing, and walked home through the cottonwoods with the sun at its highest point overhead. The weeks that followed were entirely ordinary, and yet they were not. She saw him perhaps once a week, sometimes less. Clearwater was small enough that people crossed paths at the feed store, at the lending library on Saturday mornings, at church on Sundays when Catherine went, which was not every Sunday because she was honest with herself about the limits of her relationship with formal religion. When she saw him at the feed store, he helped her load the bags into her wagon without being asked, and without making a production of it. When she saw him at the library, which surprised her the first time because she had not expected it, they talked about what they were reading. She was working through a collection of essays on agriculture by a man named Flint that the librarian had ordered specially. He was reading a history of the Civil War, which had ended 13 years earlier, but which, as he pointed out, was still very much present in the daily realities of the state they lived in. She appreciated that he said that. The injustices of Reconstruction Texas were visible everywhere to anyone willing to look. In the treatment of the black families who farmed and worked in the area, in the deliberate constraints placed on their ability to own land, in the way that certain conversations at the feed store were conducted, as though certain people in the room were furniture. Catherine had found Robert largely indifferent to these things, not cruel but incurious, and she had learned to keep her own views somewhat private in Clearwater's particular social climate. It was a careful relief to find that Luke Dawson's views aligned more closely with her own, and that he stated them plainly rather than wrapping them in the kind of careful ambiguity designed to offend no one and mean nothing. October came, and with it a change in the air that was almost violent after the long Texas summer. Catherine had gotten the north field prepared for a winter crop, the channel working correctly now and the fence repaired, and she was feeling something approaching cautious optimism about the spring when the next problem arrived in the form of a man named Del Prout. Del Prout was the kind of man that existed in every small Texas town in 1878, which was to say he was well-connected, largely useless in practical ways, and convinced that widows needed management. He was 44, owned the largest dry goods store in Clearwater, and had made it known to various intermediaries that he considered Catherine Collins's 40 acres a suitable addition to his holdings, and Catherine Collins herself a manageable inconvenience attached to said acres. He came to call on a Wednesday afternoon without sending word ahead, which was both presumptuous and tactically calculated, since she had been in the field and had to change quickly, and was therefore at a disadvantage when he sat in her parlor and made his intentions clear. He was not brutal about it. He was worse than brutal. He was reasonable and measured, and utterly certain that she would eventually see his point, which was that a woman alone could not effectively manage a farm of this size, that the practical difficulties would compound themselves, and that she ought to consider a partnership with someone who had resources and standing in the community. He meant marriage. He said everything around the word without saying it, in the way that men sometimes did when they wanted to give the impression of consideration without actually offering it. Catherine sat across from him in her parlor with her hands folded in her lap and her back very straight, and said, with complete pleasantness, that she appreciated his concern, and that she was managing her farm without difficulty, and that she did not anticipate needing a partnership of any kind in the foreseeable future. He smiled in a way that suggested he had expected this and had already planned for it. After he left, she sat in the parlor for a while longer and felt the particular chill of understanding that some battles don't end after the first engagement. She told Luke about it the following Saturday, not because she had planned to, but because they happened to be walking out of the library at the same time and he asked how things were going, and she was tired enough from the week that the truth came out before the careful version of it. He listened without the expression she had dreaded, which was sympathy of the tilted head variety. He said, "Does he have any legal standing to do anything?" She said, "Not yet. The farm is fully mine." Robert's will was simple and properly filed. Luke said, "Then his only power is social pressure," she said, "which in a town this size is not nothing." He said, "No, it's not nothing." He stopped walking and turned to look at her with a directness that she had come to expect from him and still found slightly startling. "Are you all right?" she said. "Yes." And then, because honesty had become something she practiced deliberately, "Mostly yes. It's lonely, Luke. Not in the way people expect. Not because I miss Robert particularly. Because I'm doing something real and it matters and I would like sometimes to talk to someone about it at the end of the day and there isn't anyone." She had not intended to say that. It was more than she had planned. He looked at her for a long moment and said, "I know that feeling." They walked back to the hitching post where their horses were tied, and he helped her with her saddlebag, which had developed a troublesome buckle, without making anything of it. He said, "I'm going to be fencing my western boundary next week. If you want company at the end of a day, there's no reason you couldn't ride over. I usually cook enough for 2 people even when there's only one." She said, "That seems practical." He said, "It is." She smiled. It was a small smile, but entirely genuine, and she felt it in her chest the way you feel something that has been absent for a long time when it returns. She rode over on Wednesday evening, and he had made a beef stew that was better than she had expected. And they sat at his kitchen table for 2 hours talking about everything from the best variety of winter wheat for this part of Texas to the question of whether the railroads were ultimately going to be good or catastrophic for small farming operations, which was a matter of considerable debate in 1878 and would remain so for decades. He had strong opinions. So did she. They disagreed about 2 things and agreed about 4, and by the end of the evening she felt more herself than she had in longer than she could precisely measure. She rode home under a sky full of stars, the night air cool and smelling of cedar and dried grass, and she thought, "This is dangerous," not in a frightening way, in the way that things you want very much are always a little dangerous because wanting things means you can lose them. She went back the following Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that. There was nothing improper about it. They were neighbors. They shared a property boundary and a creek, and an understanding of the particular difficulties of farming land in this part of Texas in this particular year. The widows and married women of Clearwater thought what they thought, and Catherine had long since stopped arranging her life around what people thought, or she had mostly stopped. There were still moments, arriving at church and feeling the angle of certain looks, when she felt the weight of the town's judgment like a hand on her shoulder. But the Wednesday evenings were worth it. November arrived and brought with it the first real cold, the kind of Texas cold that was not what people from the northern states considered cold, but was biting enough when the wind picked up off the plains. Catherine had prepared the farm as well as she could. The kitchen garden had come in well. She had made arrangements with the grain merchant for the spring planting that were considerably more favorable than what Robert had been getting, because she had gone back 3 times and negotiated, which Robert had not been in the habit of doing. She was feeling a tempered but genuine satisfaction about the state of things when Thomas found her one morning in the tack room and told her that someone had cut the east fence. Not just one section. A long stretch of it, maybe 30 yards. The posts pulled out rather than broken, which meant deliberate effort rather than accident or weather. She stood at the damaged fence for a long time in the early morning cold with her hands in her coat pockets and thought about Del Prout. She could not prove it was him. She understood that clearly enough. She also understood that she had no way of quickly repairing 30 yards of fence alone, that she had cattle that grazed the east pasture, and that Thomas, though willing, was not strong enough to reset fence posts without more help than she could provide herself. She rode to Luke's place at mid-morning. She explained the situation without editorializing, and he said, "Show me," and saddled his horse and came back with her. He looked at the fence with the same careful assessment she had seen him bring to the creek problem, examining the posts, the manner in which they had been removed, the ground around them. He said this was done at night, and it was done by at least 2 men, probably 3. The posts were pulled with a chain and horse. She said, "I know." He looked at her. "Prute," she said, "I cannot prove it." He said, "No," and then quietly, "But we both know." He spent the rest of that day, and all of the following day, helping her reset the fence. He brought his own post-hole digger, and an extra roll of wire that he said she could pay him back for when the spring crop came in. And he said it in the matter-of-fact way that meant he was not entirely certain she would need to pay him back, and was leaving room for that without saying so, which was a particular kind of generosity that she felt in her chest, where the small, genuine smile had been weeks earlier. Thomas worked alongside them, and by the end of the second day, the fence was in better condition than it had been before it was cut, which Catherine felt was a small but meaningful victory. That evening, when Thomas had gone home and the light was failing fast in the blue-gray way of November sunsets, she and Luke stood at the edge of the east pasture and watched the cattle settled in the restored field, and she said, "Thank you, I mean that." He said, "I know you do." She said, "Luke, I need to ask you something directly." He said, "All right." She turned to look at him. She had become accustomed to the particular quality of his attention, the way he turned it toward you fully when you spoke, no part of him looking past you toward something else. She said, "Why are you doing this? Not the fence specifically, all of it. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved the dry grass at the edge of the field, and somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek, a bird made a sound and stopped. He said, "Because you are the most interesting person I've met in a very long time, and because you are working for something real and I respect that, and because I'd rather be here helping you than anywhere else I can think of." She held his gaze and felt the whole weight of what he had not said, which was actually considerably more than what he had said and which she was not yet ready to say herself. She said, "I'll make you dinner, proper dinner, come Sunday." He said, "I'll be there." Walking to his horse, he paused and looked back and said, "Catherine, be careful with Prute. Don't give him a reason to escalate." She said, "I don't intend to." He said, "I know you don't. I'm saying it anyway." She watched him ride away in the falling dark and stood in the cold for a long time after his outline had disappeared into the distance. Sunday dinner was a roast chicken from her own flock, with root vegetables from the kitchen garden and a pie she made from the last of the autumn apples. And she set the table properly with the good cloth, and then looked at it and felt briefly self-conscious, and then reminded herself that setting a table properly was simply a matter of doing things correctly, and had nothing to do with anything else. He arrived exactly when he said he would, which she had already come to expect, and he brought a bottle of wine that he had purchased from somewhere she had not encountered in Clearwater, which meant he had planned ahead, which she also noted. They ate and talked, and the evening stretched in that particular way that evenings do when no one is watching the clock. She told him about Missouri, about her father and the farm there, about learning to read a ledger at 12 years old, because her father believed everyone should know where the money was going. He told her about growing up in East Texas, one of 4 boys, a father who had farmed cotton until the economics of it broke him in the years after the war. He told her about leaving at 18, going to work cattle because it paid, and because the open land suited something in him that had always been restless. He talked about the Kisham Trail and about the particular democracy of a cattle drive, where the ability to do the work mattered considerably more than where you came from, and about the friendship between drovers of different backgrounds that the trail created, and that the towns they stopped in often tried to dismantle. He said this with a quiet anger that was controlled but genuine, and she found herself admiring the control of it as much as the anger itself. She said, "Did you ever want to go back to East Texas?" He said, "No, it wasn't mine. I needed something mine." She said, "Yes," again and again, meant it with the full weight. They washed the dishes together without discussing it, and stood at her kitchen counter shoulder to shoulder in the warm lantern light of the kitchen, and she was aware of the precise nearness of him in a way that she had been aware of for some weeks now, but had not allowed herself to fully acknowledge. He said, "That was the best meal I've had since I left the trail." She said, "Trail food is a low bar." He said, "That's not what I mean," and looked at her sidelong with the particular expression that had started to undo her careful self-sufficiency in small but noticeable increments. She said, "I know what you mean." He left at a reasonable hour, and she stood at the door and watched him mount his horse, and he looked back once from the end of the path, the way he sometimes did, as though checking that she was still there and finding that she was, and rode away into the dark. December came to Clearwater in a way that felt like an announcement. The temperature dropped sharply in the first week, bringing with it a dry cold that cracked the earth and made the morning routine on the farm considerably more demanding. Catherine rose before light and broke the ice in the water trough before the animals could drink, and patched a gap in the barn wall where the wind was getting through, and kept the kitchen stove burning through the night on the worst evenings. She was tired in the bone-deep way of someone who is doing the work of two people, and she knew it, and she kept going. Thomas caught a bad chest cold in the second week of December, and she sent him home for 3 days with instructions not to return until he could breathe properly, which was the right thing to do and also complicated the management of the farm considerably. She was managing the extra work herself when Luke showed up one morning unannounced with his hat pulled down against the cold and offered 2 days of help without asking whether she wanted it. She said, "You don't have to do this." He said, "I know." She said, "Your own place needs work." He said, "Mine will keep." She said, "Luke." He said, "Catherine," with the patience of someone who had already decided something and was waiting for the other party to catch up. She stepped back from the doorway and let him in. The 2 days of his help meant the difference between the farm running and the farm falling behind in a way that would have been difficult to recover from, and she knew that. The practical arithmetic of it was clear. What was less clear to her, or rather what she had been keeping deliberately unclear for reasons she did not examine too closely, was the arithmetic of everything else. She examined it on the second evening, when they had finished the last of the outdoor work, and she had made coffee, and they were sitting at her kitchen table in the warmth of the stove and the quiet of the cold night outside. She had been watching him across the table for several minutes, pretending to read the farming journal open in front of her and not reading a single word. She said, "Can I ask you something personal?" He said, "You've been doing that for 2 months. I don't see why you'd stop now." She said, "Have you ever been married?" He said, "No." She said, "Why not?" He considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. He said, "I was moving for 11 years. The trail doesn't make it easy. And then by the time I stopped moving, I'd been by myself long enough that I had particular ideas about what I wanted, and it seemed better to wait for that than to settle for something comfortable and convenient and less than right." She said, "What did you want?" He said, "Someone I could talk to, really talk to." He paused. Someone who knew what they were doing and why they were doing it. Someone with her own center of gravity. She said very quietly, "Luke." He said, "I know, Catherine." The kitchen was very warm and very quiet, and the lantern on the table was turning everything gold. She said, "I am not ready. I should tell you that honestly. It has been 5 months and I am still finding out who I am on my own, and I think that matters. I think I need to know who I am alone before I can be with anyone else." He said, "I know that too." She said, "But..." He said, "Yes," she said, "but I am aware of something that I think you should also be aware of." He said, "I'm fairly certain we're both aware of it." She looked at him for a long moment, and then something loosened in her chest, something she had been holding very carefully for weeks, and she said, "Yes, we are." He reached across the kitchen table and covered her hand with his. Just that, just the warmth of his hand over hers, and they sat that way in the lantern light for a few minutes without saying anything. And it was one of the most intimate things that had happened to her in longer than she could easily remember. Christmas in Clearwater in 1878 was a modest affair by most standards, though the town made what effort it could with greenery strung along the main street and a church social on Christmas Eve that most of the community attended regardless of their actual relationship with the church. Catherine went and wore her second-best dress again, and Luke Dawson appeared from across the room at one point and came to stand beside her with a glass of cider, and they talked through the social as though it were the most natural thing in the world, which several of the women in the room noted with expressions ranging from surprise to calculated. Edna Marsh materialized at Catherine's elbow at one point and said, very quietly, "He's a good man." Catherine said, equally quietly, "I know he is." Edna said, "Good," and moved away with the self-contained dignity of someone who has said exactly what needed saying. Del Prout appeared at the social as well, which was inevitable. He was the kind of man who appeared everywhere because appearing everywhere was part of the power. He spoke to Catherine for a few minutes with a pleasantness that had an edge behind it, and he looked at Luke with the careful blankness of someone making calculations. He said nothing directly unpleasant. He never did. That was the particular difficulty of him. After the social in the cold, clear Christmas Eve, Luke walked with her to where her horse was tied, and they stood in the quiet street with their breath making small clouds in the cold air. He said, "Happy Christmas, Catherine." She said, "Happy Christmas, Luke." He said, "Will you come for Christmas dinner tomorrow? I have a turkey." "I have absolutely no idea what to do with a turkey, but I have one." She laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, nothing careful about it, the kind of laugh that comes out before you've decided whether to let it. She said, "Yes, I'll bring the pie." He grinned at her. It was the first time she had seen him properly grin, and it did something considerable to his face and an equivalent something to the interior of her chest. He said, "Deal." Christmas dinner was excellent, primarily because she managed the turkey while he managed everything else, and they worked around each other in his small kitchen with the easy choreography of people who have already learned each other's physical rhythms. They ate at his table, and the afternoon moved the way good afternoons do, slowly and fully, the light changing through the windows from the bright blue of midday to the deep gold of a Texas December afternoon. He gave her a book. It was a collection of poetry, not the sentimental kind, but the kind with actual muscle to it, the kind that looked at the world directly. She opened it at the table and read one poem aloud, and he listened with his chin on his hand and then said, "Read another one," and she did. She gave him a pair of leather-work gloves she had stitched herself over the course of several evenings, and he held them with the expression of someone receiving something they had not expected to be moved by and was moved by. He said, "You made these." She said, "I'm better at leather work than I am at poetry." He said, "You're good at most things, Catherine." She said, "Not everything." He said, "What are you not good at?" She thought about it honestly and said, "Letting things go. And accepting help without feeling like it costs me something." He said, "You've been accepting my help." She said, "I have, I'm working on it." He said, "You don't have to work so hard." She looked at him across the table with the afternoon light between them and said, "Neither do you. You don't have to be so careful with me. I'm not breakable." He said, "I know you're not. I'm not being careful because I think you're breakable. I'm being careful because I don't want to get it wrong." She held his gaze for a long moment and then said, "You're not getting it wrong." January came in hard, the way January does in North Texas when it has been storing up since November, and Catherine spent the first 2 weeks of the new year largely indoors when the weather was worst and out in it when she had no choice. The farm was functioning. The cattle were sound. The winter crops were holding. Thomas had recovered from his cold and was back at work, and she had begun paying him a slightly better wage than Robert had been paying, because she had gone over the accounts and saw that it was both fair and possible. She and Luke fell into a rhythm that she recognized as significant even as she was careful not to name it too quickly. He came to her farm twice a week, sometimes more, and she went to his on the alternate days. They shared work and meals and conversation, and sometimes long, comfortable silences that were more restful than most conversations she had with other people. They did not kiss. They had not kissed. The hand on the table at Christmas had been the furthest the physical distance between them had traveled, and she was aware of the restraint on both sides and knew what it signified. It was Edna Marsh who told her about Del Prute's next move. Edna came to call one Thursday morning in the second week of February and sat at Catherine's kitchen table with her tea and said, without preamble, that Del Prute had been making inquiries with the county land office about the water rights documentation on Miller's Creek. He was suggesting that the original land sale to Catherine's late husband had not included properly documented riparian rights, and that there might be grounds for a legal challenge to her water access. Catherine sat very still with her teacup between her hands and thought about what this meant in practical terms. Without the creek access, the north field was useless for a cash crop. Without the north field, the farm's income was halved. With the farm's income halved and the modest savings running thin, the practical arithmetic of independence became considerably more complicated. She said, "Is there anything to it?" "Legally," Edna said, "I don't know enough law to say for certain. But I know that these things tend to go the way of the man with more money and more connections, regardless of what the documents say." Catherine said, "Yes, I know that." Edna said, "There is a lawyer in San Antonio who has been helpful to people in situations like this. His name is Vargas. He has experience with land rights, particularly in cases where documentation is being contested." Catherine wrote down the name. She went to Luke that evening and told him everything, because she was past the point of deciding whether to tell him things. She just told him. He listened all the way through, and his expression when she finished was the controlled but genuine anger she had seen before when he talked about injustice, except this time it was focused. He said, "Prute is using the legal system to do what his fence-cutting accomplices couldn't do physically." She said, "Yes," he said. "What do you want to do?" she said. "I want to write to this lawyer in San Antonio. I want to have someone who understands the law look at every piece of documentation I have on this property. And I want to go to the land office myself and request copies of every relevant document, because if he's been making inquiries there, I want to know exactly what was and was not properly recorded." He said, "I'll go with you," she said, "to the land office." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because two people asking questions are harder to dismiss than one, and because I have a legal interest in the creek myself, and because I am not going to sit on my side of Miller's Creek while someone tries to take yours." She looked at him for a long moment and felt something that was not quite gratitude, or not only gratitude, something that was larger and warmer and considerably more complicated than that. She said, "All right." They went to the county land office together on a Monday morning, and she was glad he was there, not because she could not have managed it herself, but because she watched the clerk's manner shift subtly in the presence of a man, become more forthcoming and less subtly dismissive, and the pragmatist in her acknowledged that this was a real dynamic in 1878 Texas and used it. The documents told an interesting story. The original land grant for her property had included water rights documentation, properly filed, that had apparently been overlooked or conveniently forgotten in Prute's inquiries. The clerk found it after 30 minutes of searching and was visibly uncomfortable about having found it, which told Catherine something additional about where Prute's influence extended. She requested certified copies of everything and paid the fee, and walked out of the land office into the bright February morning with a file of documents under her arm and Luke beside her, and felt something that was satisfaction edged with anger, which was a combination she had come to recognize as her natural state in the presence of injustice. She wrote to the lawyer Vargas that afternoon with a summary of the situation and copies of the key documents. He wrote back within 2 weeks with a clear and direct assessment. Her water rights were properly documented, the challenge had no legal merit, and if Prout pursued it through formal channels he would lose. The question, Vargas wrote with the careful language of experience, was whether Del Prout's objective was actually to win a legal argument, or whether it was to make the process expensive and exhausting enough to accomplish the same result as winning. Catherine read that letter sitting at her kitchen table on a late February evening with the fire going and the wind outside, and understood it with the full weight of its meaning. She walked to Luke's place the next morning because she could not wait until the usual day and knocked on his door, and when he answered she said, "I need to talk through something." And he opened the door wide and said, "Come in, the coffee's still hot." She talked through the lawyer's letter and her thoughts about it and then sat back in her chair and said, "I am not going to be driven out. I need you to know that. I'm not going to be maneuvered out of my own farm by a man who believes the only thing standing between him and 40 acres is my patience." Luke said, "I know you're not," she said, "but I need to think about how to make that clear without giving him a legal pretext for anything." He said, "There's another way to make it clear." She looked at him. He said, "The spring planting. If you put in a full crop on the north field, a proper commercial crop, registered with the grain merchant before the season opens, it creates a documented economic reality around that water access that complicates any future challenge considerably." She said, "That's not just a strategic argument. That's a genuinely good farming idea." He said, "Most of the best strategic arguments around here also turn out to be good farming ideas." She said, "I'll need to get the seed order in this week." He said, "I'll lend you the money for the seed if the accounts are tight right now. Pay me back from the harvest." She said, "Luke." He said, "Catherine, you have spent 6 months working yourself into the ground to build something real. I am not going to let the timing of a cash flow problem be the thing that undoes it. This is a practical loan between neighbors with a clear repayment arrangement. That is all it is." She said, "That is not all it is." He said, "No, but it can be treated as though it is, and that is fine with me." She took the loan and put in the seed order and planted the north field in March with spring wheat, and registered the planting with the grain merchant in April, and the documented economic reality that Luke had described came into being in the county records the same week that Del Prout apparently decided that the legal strategy was not going to be productive. He did not disappear from the social landscape of Clearwater. Men like Del Prout did not disappear. But his attention appeared to redirect itself toward other possibilities, which Catherine interpreted as a pragmatic retreat rather than a genuine change of character. She remained careful. She remained watchful. But she allowed herself to exhale properly for the first time since September. March in Clearwater was the kind of month that made the whole terrible winter feel like it had been worth it. The light came back in a way that changed the quality of everything. The land came back to life in its own incremental and inexorable way, and Catherine walked her fields in the early mornings and watched the green appearing in the turned earth, and felt a joy that was physical and specific and entirely hers. Luke came by one morning in the middle of March, and they walked the fields together, as they had fallen into the habit of doing on alternating properties, each of them looking at the other's land with the particular interest of someone who had invested in its well-being. He was quiet as they walked, but it was a different kind of quiet than his usual quiet, which was the comfortable kind. This was the kind that had something moving underneath it. She said, "What are you thinking?" He said, "I've been thinking about something for a while and I'm trying to decide how to say it." She said, "You could say it plainly. You usually do." He stopped walking. They were at the far end of the north field, the creek audible beyond the line of cottonwoods, the spring morning all light and birdsong and the smell of fresh turned earth. He said, "I am in love with you, Catherine. The morning continued around them, entirely unaffected. She stood very still and felt the words land with the full weight that words only rarely carry, the kind of weight that rearranges something structural inside you rather than just adding to the surface. She said, "I know." He said with something that was half careful hope and half humor, "Is that all?" She said, "No, that's not all." She turned to face him fully. "I have been telling myself for months that I needed to be certain before I said anything, that I needed to be sure it was real and not just gratitude or loneliness or proximity." He said, "And," she said, "I am certain. I have been certain for some time, if I'm honest, which I am trying always to be." She paused. "I love you too, Luke. I have been carrying it around for months and not saying it because I was afraid of how much it mattered." He looked at her with that full attention of his that she had come to know so well, and she watched something change in his face, something open. He reached up and touched her face with one hand, just touched her cheek with the back of his fingers, and she leaned into it slightly the way you lean toward warmth. And then he kissed her, there in the north field in the March morning, and it was gentle and certain and entirely right. April moved through the farm country of North Texas with the particular busyness that spring planting demanded, and Catherine and Luke worked their properties with the focused energy of people who know what they are building and why. They were honest with each other and with the town about what was between them, which meant that the social calculations of Clearwater had to readjust themselves, which they did, because small towns always do. Edna Marsh approved visibly. Thomas, in the careful way of quiet boys who work hard and pay attention, appeared to relax in a manner that suggested he had been worried about things he had not felt able to name, and was relieved that they had resolved themselves. The conversations between Catherine and Luke had by this point accumulated enough shared history and mutual reference to have their own internal grammar, the kind that develops between people who have been genuinely honest with each other about things that matter. They disagreed about things. They always had. They disagreed about the best approach to the southern boundary fence, which was a minor matter that resolved itself with a site visit. They disagreed about whether the ongoing violence and displacement being carried out against the Comanche people in the north of the state should be discussed openly in Clearwater's public spaces, or whether open discussion simply invited retaliation from those with power, which was a larger and less easily resolved matter that they argued about seriously over several evenings without reaching a satisfying conclusion. Because some arguments do not have satisfying conclusions, and the best you can do is make sure you are asking the right questions. May brought the wheat in the north field to a height that made Catherine stand at the field edge every morning with something close to reverence. It was her crop, planned and planted and tended through the frosts of March and the late cold snap of early April, and it was going to produce. She could see it in the color of the grain heads, in the density of the rows. She had gotten the water right and the soil preparation and the timing. She had done this herself, from raw knowledge and hard work and a stubbornness that had served her extremely well. Luke came by on a Saturday morning in May when the field was at its most beautiful, the wheat moving in a light wind, the sky above it the particular blue of a Texas May morning. He stood beside her at the field edge and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Look at what you built." She said, "Look at what you helped me build." He said, "No, this is yours, Catherine. You planned this and planted this. I lent you seed money and carried a post-hole digger 2 days in December. You did the rest." She looked at the field for a long moment and then looked at him and said, "I know it's mine, but I'm glad you were here for it." He said, "So am I." He asked her to marry him the following Saturday. He did not do it dramatically. He did not do it at church in front of the congregation, which she would have found mortifying, or at the feed store, which would have been worse. He did it on a Saturday morning in June in her own kitchen where she was making bread and her hands were floury and her hair was not arranged, and he came in from checking on something in the barn and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "I would like to marry you, Catherine, when you're ready and not before." She said, "I'm ready." He said, "You don't have to say that to be kind." She said, "Luke, I'm not kind in that particular way, you know that." He said, "I do know that, that's why I believe you." She said, "Yes. My answer is yes." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her again, flower hands and all, and it was warmer than the first one and had more of the future in it. They were married in September, 1 year almost exactly from the morning she had walked through the cottonwoods along Miller's Creek to talk about water rights. Reverend Moore performed the ceremony in the same churchyard where Robert had been buried, and where Catherine and Robert had once made their own promises. And Catherine had made her peace with this before the day came, because she was honest with herself about the past, and did not ask it to be different from what it was. The future was the thing she was building, and it was being built on solid ground. Edna Marsh stood for her as witness. Luke's older brother had come down from East Texas for the occasion, a man named Daniel who was built along the same lines as Luke but funnier, and who approved of Catherine within the first 10 minutes of their acquaintance, which she knew because he told her so directly, which was apparently a family trait. The wedding was small and real, and exactly what both of them wanted. They came home to her farm, which they had already agreed would be the center of operations, with his land running as a secondary property for grazing. The two properties together made a genuine small-scale enterprise with a future in it, and they had already spent several evenings at the kitchen table with the ledgers open between them, planning the next 3 years, which was a deeply satisfying kind of evening for both of them. The first winter of their marriage was the warmest Catherine had known in Clearwater, not because the weather was mild, but because the house was no longer silent. It was full of Luke's movements and Luke's voice, and the particular sounds of a person who belonged there and knew it. She had forgotten, in the 18 months of Robert's illness and the year of her widowhood, that houses could feel like that. Full in the good way, not heavy but alive, they argued sometimes. Not destructively, not the kind of arguing that erodes things, but the kind that honest people who have real opinions do sometimes, about how to handle the South Field, about whether Thomas's wage should be raised again, about a letter that came from the state government regarding some new land survey requirements that seemed designed to create complications for small farms, while benefiting the large cattle operations backing the men who drafted them. They wrote a letter together in response to that last thing, a letter that was respectful and very clear, and which went to 3 different officials, because Luke had learned from experience that clear letters sent to multiple addresses were harder to ignore than one letter to one address. February of 1880 brought news that Catherine had been expecting since October but had not said aloud until she was certain. She told Luke on a Sunday morning over breakfast, plainly, as she told him everything. She said, "You are going to be a father in July." He set his coffee cup down and looked at her, and she watched everything she had hoped to see move across his face in the uncalculated way that genuine emotion moves. He said, "July," she said, "approximately. Dr. Hennessy thinks July." He said, "Catherine," she said, "I know." He got up from the table and came around to her side and crouched beside her chair, which was not a graceful position for a man of his size but was clearly the position that felt right to him, and he took both her hands in his and looked at her with the full weight of everything they had built together in his face. He said, "Are you all right? Are you healthy?" She said, "Very healthy." Hennessy says I am one of the most practical pregnant women he has encountered, which I chose to take as a compliment. Luke said, "It is a compliment," she said. "I know." He kissed her hands, one and then the other, and she felt tears in her eyes for no particular reason she could name except that she had not expected this much. She had not expected any of this, not the creek repair that turned into a friendship, not the Wednesday evenings that turned into something real, not the Northfield wheat that proved something important to herself, not this particular man who had walked into her life carrying nothing but honest attention and a willingness to show up when he said he would. She had not expected to feel this full again. She had prepared herself for a life that was functional and meaningful but perhaps not full in this way. She had told herself that was enough. It was not. She knew that now. Luke looked up and saw the tears and said, "Hey," quietly. She said, "I'm all right. I don't know why I'm crying." He said, "You don't need to know why." She said, "That is the least helpful thing you have ever said to me." He laughed, and she laughed through the tears, which was so much better than crying alone that it felt like a different thing entirely. The spring planting of 1880 proceeded with adjustments for Catherine's condition, though she refused adjustments she deemed unnecessary and accepted the ones that were genuinely practical. Luke managed the heavier work without making a performance of it, which she appreciated. Thomas, now 18 and considerably more capable than when she had first hired him, took on additional responsibility with the kind of willing competence that made Catherine feel she had done something right in keeping him on and paying him fairly. Del Prout had apparently relocated his ambitions to the county seat and was largely absent from the daily commerce of Clearwater, which suited everyone. He had run for a local office of some kind and lost, which various people in town reported with varying degrees of satisfaction, and the satisfaction was not Catherine's most admirable quality, but she had it. June arrived with the heat and the particular beauty of the land in high summer, the wheat from the north field already harvested and sold, the proceeds clear and clean in the farm's ledger. Catherine was enormous and uncomfortable and productive, continuing to manage the farm's accounts and the correspondence and the decisions that could be made from a chair at the kitchen table, which was more than most people gave her credit for. The baby arrived on a Wednesday. Catherine thought afterward that this was appropriate, given that Wednesdays had been the evenings that started everything. It was a boy, which neither of them had predicted one way or another, because they had been careful not to wish for one over the other. He was healthy and loud about it from the first moment, which Dr. Hennessy said was an excellent sign. He was born in the heat of a Texas July morning, with the curtains moving in the window over the bed, and Luke sitting on the edge of the bed holding Catherine's hand through the whole of it, which was not the common arrangement in 1880, but was the arrangement that Catherine had stated she expected, and that no one present had felt able to argue with. They named him James Marcus Dawson. James for Luke's father, who had been a hard man but a fair one. Marcus for Catherine's father, who had taught her to read a ledger and negotiate at the grain merchants, and stand up straight when the world pushed. The morning after James was born, Catherine was lying in bed with the baby asleep against her side and Luke sitting in the chair beside the bed, not sleeping, watching both of them with the expression of someone who cannot quite believe what is in front of them and is not trying to. She said, "You should sleep." He said, "I will." She said, "Luke." He said, "Yes." She said, "Are you happy?" He said, without any hesitation at all, "Yes." "Catherine, I am completely happy." She said, "So am I." She paused. "I did not expect to be. I mean, I hoped, but I didn't expect." He said, "I know. Neither did I." The baby made a sound and shifted against her without waking. Outside the window, the Texas summer was doing exactly what it always did, which was be enormous and relentless and entirely indifferent. And inside the room there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. It was in October of that same year, when James was 3 months old and the farm was settling into the rhythms of autumn, that the moment happened that Catherine would return to for the rest of her life, whenever she tried to understand what happiness actually meant in its specific and particular form. She had been having a difficult morning, not a catastrophic one. Just the accumulated weight of a morning that went wrong in small ways, the kind that is harder to bear than a single large disaster, because there is nothing specific enough to be angry about. James had been awake most of the night. The account she had been working on had an error somewhere she could not locate. Thomas had come to tell her that one of the mares seemed off, and she had gone out to look, and had come back uncertain whether it was serious or not. She was tired in the deep way of someone who had been tired for 3 months, and was managing it, but did not have much margin left. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the accounts in front of her and the baby in the cradle beside the table and a cup of cold tea she had forgotten to drink, and she heard Luke's step on the porch. He came in through the door and he was carrying something. He had been out to check on something along the fence line, and she had not expected him back for another hour. What he was carrying was a bunch of sunflowers. Big ones, the kind that grew wild along the creek bank and the fence lines in late summer and into the early autumn, golden and strong-spined, and exactly the color of the afternoon light when it was at its most generous. He had clearly cut them on his way back, not with any ceremony but just because they were there and they were beautiful. He set them on the kitchen table in front of her. He said, "I found these along the south fence." She looked at them. The sunflowers sat on the account books and the cold tea and the difficult morning and the accumulated weight of the weeks, and they were so specifically and entirely beautiful that something inside her simply gave way. She started to cry. Not the careful tears she had shed when she told Luke about the baby, not the controlled grief tears from a year ago at Robert's grave. These were different. These were the kind of tears that come from somewhere below thought, from the place where the body keeps all the things the mind has been managing too carefully for too long. She put her face in her hands and cried with no particular plan to stop. Luke sat down beside her immediately and put his arm around her and held her without saying anything, which was exactly right because there was nothing to say that would have been as useful as just the holding. After a while she said, through the tears, "I don't know why I'm crying." He said, "You don't have to know," she said. "That's what you said before, in February." He said, "It was true then too." She said, "I'm not sad." He said, "I know you're not," she said. I think I'm," and stopped because she did not have the word for what she was. Full again, but differently than before. It was the specific fullness of someone who had prepared for very little and been given a great deal, and the disproportion of it had accumulated quietly until the sunflowers arrived and opened the gate. She had been expecting nothing. Not literally nothing. She was not a woman who wallowed in that particular darkness. But she had drawn the borders of her expectations carefully around what was probable and reasonable and earned. She had not expected someone to bring her sunflowers from the fence line because they were beautiful. She had not expected to be loved that casually and that completely. She dried her face eventually and looked at Luke, and he looked back at her with the steady brown eyes that she knew as well as she knew her own fields by now. She said, "I love you very much, you know that." He said, "Yes," she said, "the sunflowers are the most beautiful thing." He said, "I'll bring you more." She said, "Don't you dare, I'll never recover." He laughed and she laughed, and James woke up in the cradle and announced himself at considerable volume. And Luke reached down and lifted his son with the ease of a man who had been doing this for 3 months, and held him against his chest, and the baby, who had been objecting to everything for most of the morning, immediately quieted. She watched this with the sunflowers bright on the table beside her and thought, "This is the thing. This is what the whole year of work and loss and survival and courage was building toward," though she could not have known it in September of 1878, when she walked through the cottonwoods to talk about water rights with a neighbor she had not yet met. This is what the Northfield wheat meant, and what the fence posts meant, and what the Wednesday evenings meant, and what every difficult morning that she had gotten through alone had been in service of, without her knowing it. The farm continued to grow through the following years in the particular way of things that are properly tended. The South Field was brought into production in 1881 and produced a respectable corn crop that went a long way toward making the financial position of the Dawson farm entirely stable rather than merely adequate. Luke's northern property continued as grazing land, the cattle small in number but healthy and well selected, and he proved to have an eye for livestock that translated over time into a modest but genuine supplementary income. Catherine took on the correspondence for 2 other small farms in the area, whose owners were not comfortable with the paperwork demands of the county's increasingly complex land records. She was paid modestly for this and did it in the evenings at the kitchen table, with the practical satisfaction of someone doing useful work with skills that would otherwise be underutilized. Edna Marsh told her she should open a proper service for it, which Catherine was considering. Thomas grew into a genuinely good farmer over the course of these years, and by the time he was 21, Catherine had adjusted his position to something closer to a junior partner in the farm's operations, with a share in the profits, which was an arrangement that several people in Clearwater found unusual but which worked extremely well in practice. He married a young woman from a farm family near the county seat in 1883, a practical and warm-hearted woman named Clara, and Catherine and Luke stood for them as witnesses, which felt entirely appropriate given what Thomas had witnessed for them. James Marcus Dawson grew into a boy who had his mother's directness and his father's patience, and the combined capacity for observation that both of them carried, which made him simultaneously an excellent small farmer in training and occasionally an alarming conversationalist. By the time he was 3, he had decided opinions about the wheat varieties in the North Field and expressed them without reservation. In the spring of 1883, Catherine told Luke that James was going to have a brother or sister, and this time she told him over breakfast in the same practical way as before, and this time he did not set down his coffee cup first. He set it down after, very carefully, and then he stood up and picked her up, and she said, "Luke, I am not a sack of grain," and he said, "I know exactly what you are," and held her there in the kitchen in the morning light until she stopped pretending to object. The baby arrived in November and was a girl. They named her Alice Ruth Dawson. Ruth for Edna Marsh, whose given name was Ruth Edna and who had gone by Edna her entire adult life because she preferred it, and who was informed of the honor at Sunday dinner and received the information with a composure that broke, briefly and completely, into something so unguarded that Catherine looked away to give her privacy. Alice was a different kind of child than James from the beginning. Where James was deliberate and observational, Alice was vivid and loud and in constant motion, and she had opinions about everything from a very early age and no hesitation about expressing them. She had her father's brown eyes and her mother's absolute certainty about what she thought, and the combination was formidable. By the winter of 1884, the Dawson farm had acquired the kind of stability that felt, not like an ending, but like a solid beginning from which other things could grow. The accounts were clear. The land was productive. The house had been expanded by a full room in the summer, Luke and Thomas doing the framing themselves over the course of 3 weeks, and it was no longer a house that was adequate to its occupants, but one that fit them properly. Catherine sat at her kitchen table one evening in December, the children asleep, Luke reading across the table from her, the lamp between them turning everything the color of warmth. The sunflowers from October were long gone, of course, but she had dried the last of them and set them in a jar on the windowsill where they had faded over the weeks to a color that was still beautiful in its way, the gold gone to amber and the petals paper-thin. She looked at them sometimes and thought about that morning, about the accounts on the table and the cold tea, and the morning that went wrong in small ways and Luke coming in with the sunflowers and everything that had opened up in her that she had not known needed opening. She thought about how she had not expected any of this, not specifically and not in any general way. She had expected to get through the year. She had expected to keep her farm and her independence, and perhaps to find something that resembled contentment in the earning of those things. She had not expected Luke Dawson or Wednesday evenings, or the specific way he listened when she talked, or the argument about the south fence that turned out to be right on both sides, or the morning in the north field when the wheat was moving, and he had said, "Look at what you built." She had not expected to be loved the way that she was loved, which was to say, really, and as herself, and without any requirement to be different or smaller. She had not expected the sunflowers. Luke looked up from his book and caught her looking at him and said, "What?" she said. "Nothing, I'm thinking." He said, "About what?" she said. "About how much has happened since September of 1878. He thought about this and said, "A considerable amount." She said, "Do you have any regrets?" About any of it. He put the book down. He gave the question the consideration it deserved, which was one of the things she had loved about him since the beginning, that he did not dismiss questions. He said, "I regret that it took me 11 years on the trail to figure out that this was what I wanted, but I don't think I would have known what I wanted if I hadn't spent that time. So I'm not sure that's a proper regret," she said. "I think I regret that I was so careful for so long, that I kept the borders of my expectations so small." He said, "You were surviving." She said, "Yes." "And now I'm not just surviving." He said, "No, now you're not." Outside, the December wind was moving through the cottonwoods along Miller's Creek, and the Texas night was cold and clear and enormous. And inside the house the lamp was burning, and the children were asleep, and the dried sunflowers on the windowsill were the color of old gold. And Catherine Collins, who was Catherine Dawson now and had been for 4 years, felt the completeness of everything that had been built and everything that would continue to be built, and understood that this was what happiness looked like in its specific and unglamorous and entirely real form, not the absence of difficulty. Not the absence of hard mornings or complex arguments or the ongoing injustices of the world they lived in that required attention and honest engagement. Not the absence of grief for what had been lost or courage required for what was uncertain. Just this: a kitchen table and a lamp, and the man who had brought her sunflowers on a morning when she was expecting nothing, and the life that had grown from that ordinary, extraordinary moment into something neither of them could have imagined when they stood at the edge of Miller's Creek in the autumn of 1878 and talked about water rights and slowly, without planning to, talked about everything else. She picked up her pen and went back to the accounts. Luke went back to his book. The lamp burned. The creek ran. The farm slept in the winter dark, waiting for spring. And Catherine Dawson, who had survived a year alone and built something real and let herself be loved and cried over sunflowers without being able to explain why and had never needed to, was entirely and specifically happy, which was exactly enough, which was, in fact, everything.